Hey guys, what is up? Pellic here, back with another video, and I have kind of a refinement or a change in my trinket video that I made earlier on in the season. Now that things have been a bit more established, I have a bit more concrete info to share with you about top trinkets for Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus specifically. The video that I put out before still is mostly all up to date, but there are a couple changes that I want to kind of throw out there just to get a bit more context and clarification for what you're seeing both in the guides and then also a lot of Shadow Priest running in the top keys as well. So let's dive into trinkets. All right, so I'm going to use the Icy Veins guide as kind of a backdrop to talk through some of these points. If you want to see that, please check the link in the description below. If I do make any changes, that will be the most up-to-date. Keeping videos up to date can be a little difficult, so doing my best though as the season goes on. Probably not going to see any changes, but there's always a possibility. So now, with Season 4 as a Shadow Priest, you have access to a plethora of trinkets, as you probably already know. With that, there kind of gives you more options. So a lot of people are kind of looking for a simple answer where you're like, okay, what are my two best trinkets? I'm going to get those and then use them all of the time. So the game could work that way if you want, but there is a lot of room to min-max different trinket choices depending on what you're specifically trying to bring to your key. So we're talking about Mythic Plus in particular, and really any of the trinkets inside of S tier, using these as a combination with each other are going to be really good combinations. You can use trinkets in other tiers, but the guys in this tier are particularly the really strong ones. So if you're using two things in this tier category, you're going to be pretty much set for keys. Now the change comes in is what combinations do you use and for which purpose? So I'm going to go through these one by one first, and then we can talk about different combinations of them particularly. So to start off, let's talk about Tome of Unstable Power. So this trinket, while it was nerfed slightly, it is still extremely strong. So it's just a passive AoE proc chance trinket. The procs do actually scale with haste. In some cases, this is actually undersimming a little bit. It says it procs 1 to 3 illusions, but in reality, it can actually proc up to 5 illusions. The 5 illusion proc does happen sometimes in Sims, but I think we just hard-coded it to like a 1% chance, which is just kind of us guessing. There's nothing in spell data to show that. But this can be something to try out, especially if you're looking to doing big AoE damage. So this is our mass AoE trinket. It's a nice set it and forget it option for sure, and it's particularly great for fortified weeks. So that's where some of the decision comes in. If you're doing high fortified keys, this trinket's pretty great. But on Tyrannical, it's not great at single target damage, so maybe it's worth taking the overall hit there to run something that is better on single target. Alright, so the next trinket to talk about is Vessel of Searing Shadow. So this is kind of a relatively newer thing that we discovered later on in the patch. The great thing about Vessel of Searing Shadow is that it actually does a fire damage dot on the player, gives you some haste, and then will eventually hit a single target hit on a mob that you're hitting. So the big benefit here is mostly that it's a big single target trinket. It's great for raiding, that kind of stuff. We didn't actually initially recommend this for Mythic Plus because it doesn't really have a whole lot of AoE power here, except in just the fact that it gives you haste, which we love haste this patch, particularly inside of AoE. The big difference though, and why this has kind of seen more relevance, particularly on Tyrannical weeks, is because not only does it give you the more single target, but it also procs the fire damage rings in particular. So the Seal of Diurnus Chosen and Seal of Filial Duty, the damage trinket or the damage ring and the shield ring, it will proc these way more than you would if you just have the Helm enchant and Vakash. So this trinket gets really great when you're trying to maximize the procs of those, either to get more defensive value with the shields, or if you want a bit more damage out of your ring value. So this can be really good, especially on Tyrannical weeks, which is why it's in this list. Next up, we have Umbral Skull's Fractured Heart. You've probably seen this a little bit. There's also a weak core that you can use to help track this trinket because it does do an execute mechanic, which is not currently tracked by details or Warcraft logs at the time of this recording. So if you're just trying to parse and that kind of thing, it's not going to be the best trinket for that. But if you're trying to time keys and get through keys faster, having at least one of these trinkets in your group can be really valuable, especially because, again, it does increase the amount of procs you get with haste with this trinket in particular. So it's really good for single target, and the execute is phenomenal whenever it works on a really big target, particularly like a mini boss. There's also a couple of council bosses like in Nokud or the first boss in Brackenhide, which it can work on as well. So Umbral Skulls is a great option, completely passive, good single target, and really strong if no one else in your group actually has one. Like I mentioned, there's a weak core you can get for this as well. If you want it, I'll make sure to link it in the description below. Next up, we have two on-use trinkets, really the only two in this list, which is Spoils of Neltharis and Ashes of the Ember Soul. If you're doing cases where, you're pulling really big chunks of mob around your 2-minute cooldowns, and you're kind of pulling the dungeon around them, an on-use trinket is a really great option, especially at higher target count stuff. We don't actually love the value of these trinkets at single target, especially at like depending on kill times, but they can still be strong in those really high push keys. Now, whether or not you use spoils or ashes, if you're in that kind of environment, doesn't really matter. You kind of just pick whichever one is higher item level. So because you can actually buy Ashes of the Ember Soul with your Boolean or get it from Raid at a higher item level in Mythic, you might see Ashes be a little bit more popular with the really high key players because they can just buy this guy at the highest item level, whereas Spoils, farmable, is only 522. Now, of course, if you vault a Spoils, you could prefer it. The other thing to keep in mind is that Ashes of the Ember Soul has this little extra proc. If you're in those kind of dire circumstances, you get an extra free proc as well. If that happens, it pretty much claps Spoils, but otherwise, Spoils is usually preferred depending on if they're equal item level or not. Okay, so the next up trinket is Neltharion's Call to Suffering. This guy is really like a really massive damage trinket when it procs. So the kind of downside of this trinket is the upside. When you get a proc, you're going to do old god levels of damage, especially if it's inside of your cooldowns. But if you don't get procs, or if you don't get procs outside of your cooldowns, this thing is going to look a little worse than what it's actually simming for. So on average, you're going to get an uptime of 20%. If you're using this in a key and it's less than 20%, note you're getting way less value than what it's actually simming for. But if you're getting more than that, this thing's going to look amazing. So you're going to see this all over the place in parses, especially inside of raiding or like even Mythic Plus logging. If you get a whole lot of procs, it's going to feel great. But if you don't get a lot of procs, it's not going to feel the best. In higher keys, though, you're kind of in combat the entire time. So in some senses, you're hedging your bets on the RNG of the trinket by always pulling big all of the time, and our out of cooldown damage is pretty good. So in really high keys, it becomes a little bit better, but the lower the key is, the more downtime that you have, you might just be struggling to see really good value out of this trinket. If this sounds fun to play with, by all means, go for it. I think it could be a great option, but it's not something I would suggest as a default choice if you're just running like +8s and +10s, that kind of thing, although the visual of when it procs is pretty sweet, so there is that. Alright, now lastly, you can also consider running Ominous Chromatic Essence or Whispering Incarnate icon. These are kind of dependent on if your group is also using them. So if you have like 3 or 4 people in your group also using Ominous Chromatic Essence, adding this can be really strong not only for you but your entire group damage. So that can be something to consider and kind of bump it a little bit into the S tier category. Same thing with Whispering Incarnate icon. If your tank or healer is also using this, or ideally both, again, this becomes super S tier as well, and you can buy these as well. For most people, though, probably just pass on them and just run any of the other ones until your group is in that situation. Or if not, no big deal. They're not that great anyways. In terms of like, you know, are they that much stronger when your whole group has it? Not really. Are they okay? Sure. Now, let's talk about trinket combos. So I have listed a few in this guide. It's kind of like a rough guide of like when you want certain combinations. But again, just run what makes sense for you. If you're looking for more single target, run Vessel of Searing Shadow. If you want to just do RNG Fest max damage, Nelth's Call to Suffering and Tome of Unstable Power. If you're pulling bigger on your cooldowns, use one of the on-use trinkets with Tome, or maybe some of the on-use trinkets with Neltharion's Call to Suffering if you want that kind of RNG. I would personally suggest a lot of people start with Umbral Skulls and Tome as like your 2 go-to options. Maybe weaving in Vessel once you get the rings to get more procs of those. And then as you start pulling bigger around your cooldowns, then adding Spoils or Ashes. And then if you just like the RNG playstyle of Neltharions, feel free to slap that on as well. So hopefully this helps you make your trinket choices for Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus. If you have questions, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And again, this will be linked down in the description if you want the full info. So big thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video. See ya.